Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and today I want to talk about the important and very profoundly beautiful symbolism in the film Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, what the heck is Sophie Scholl, The Final Days? And you wouldn't be alone in that, because when I talk to people about this movie, one of the most common responses I get from people is, I've never heard of that movie, what is it? Which kind of astounds me a little bit, actually, because of just how important this film is. Sophie Scholl, The Final Days came out in 2005, so it's within a year of Downfall, the other big sort of German World War II movie. It's set during World War II. You will recognise, if you've watched Downfall, you will recognise some of the same actors and actresses in this film, Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. It's a German language film. One of the reasons why I'm kind of astounded that more people don't know about this film is the fact that Sophie Scholl is actually quite an important figure within German culture. And it's kind of strange that her heroic bravery and that of her brother Hans, Christoph Probst, Kurt Huber and Willy Graf. There's a lot of other people who are involved in what is known as the White Rose Resistance Group, that they are sort of pivotal in starting in Germany. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But it's kind of surprising to me that not more is known about them outside of Germany, because what they did was so very important. They were very well known heroic figures of anti-Nazi resistance, peaceful, overt anti-Nazi resistance in Germany itself under the Nazi regime, and they're well known in Germany for that. But for some reason outside of Germany, their story hasn't travelled as far and wide as I think it should have. Second reason why I'm a little bit surprised why more people haven't heard about this film is the fact that it was actually a nomination for Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards in 2006. So it was one of 5 films that was nominated. It didn't win, but it received a nomination. And it seems to me that something that has received a nomination should get a bit more publicity than what this one did. And I think it's criminal, the fact that this film is so woefully underrated, because it's just so important. I mean, it's a very well-made film, but it's, more importantly, the subject matter is so very, very important. It tells the story of, it focuses on Sophie Scholl, but it tells the story of Hans and Sophie Scholl and the other members of the White Rose, which was a peaceful, overt anti-Nazi resistance group that was started in Germany by this young brother and sister and a group of their young friends. And it's quite amazing what they did, and we'll talk more about this towards the end of this video, because I think it actually shows a really powerful and beautiful example of how you are supposed to respond to evil, as opposed to the current trend towards punch a Nazi, as if somehow adding violence to violence and brutality to brutality and fascism to fascism somehow is the answer, when it really is not. And this group of young people show a profoundly beautiful and I think authentically true and good way of responding to evil, which is just so very, very courageous too. The film itself focuses primarily on Sophie, and it's not like, say, Downfall. Downfall has a much bigger budget, and Downfall has a much bigger scope. Lots of visual effects, lots of sets. It sort of canvases a much bigger scope and scale and everything else. This film is a lot more scaled down, but it uses its budget well, in my opinion. It's most of the film actually feels like it feels more like a stage play. It's really about the dialogue, and it's so important, because the dialogue really is important, because what you're talking about here is competing visions for the human person, competing visions for society. And you can't really give a superficial treatment to that kind of thing. You can't just do big explosions and make it superficial. You've got to go deep, and depth requires thought. It requires dialogue. It requires a considered expression of competing ideas. And this film does that really well, and it feels more like a stage play. It's more about the different dialogues. It focuses in primarily on Sophie Scholl, who is 21 years of age when she is executed by the Germans in February 1943. Her crime, that she was caught and arrested and charged and within a matter of days executed for in a guillotine, was handing out or distributing pamphlets at a German university. And that was all it took. And for daring to speak out against Nazism, to have a voice counter to the state norm, the authority norm, was all it took. And they were considered to be treasonous and dangerous traitors of the regime. What makes it even more fascinating is the fact that they were actually some young people who themselves had been through the Hitler Youth movement before they'd begun to realise that something was terribly amiss here. And they have this profound intellectual and spiritual conversion, and they realise that at the heart of Nazism is a culture of death, and they don't want any part of it. And so they very deliberately move themselves away from it in a particular way, which we'll talk about towards the end, that I think is so very, very important and offers us a profoundly important example even today. The film, as I said, sort of follows dialogues that Sophie is having. There's a dialogue initially with the other members of the White Rose that she's part of, and then really the biggest chunk of dialogue are these interrogations she has with Robert Moore, who is he's like a prosecutor policeman. He represents the state, he represents the German people at different times. We'll talk more about him in a minute and the symbolism of his character. And then there are dialogues that she has with other ancillary characters. There's a reasonable chunk of dialogue. It's certainly not as big as the dialogue she has with Robert Moore, but there's a reasonable chunk of dialogue in the courtroom when they're put on trial. There's the dialogue she has with another female prisoner who she shares a cell with, and they sort of interdisperse throughout her interrogation sessions. And then there's the dialogue with her parents as well. And it's really all about exploring who they are, what they stand for, and in quite a profound way, this film really gets to the heart of the great corruption of the human person and of conscience and human flourishing that the Nazi regime represents. It's not a film that shows you graphic images of the Holocaust and tries to get you through the doorway of recognizing the evil here through the use of perhaps those more traditional sort of visual methods. It doesn't shock you really in that way. Instead, it's about this deeper contemplation of what is really rotten at the heart of Nazism, and also perhaps some of the things that led up to the corruption of the German state by the Nazi regime. The film ends with the execution of the three primary members of the White Rose that this film focuses on. It's really, this is Sophie Scholl's film, but her brother Hans is also there at the end, and Christoph Probst, another member of the White Rose. His wife had recently had their third child, a few weeks old. He at the time he went to his execution, he hadn't even seen his youngest child. So profoundly beautiful courage that these young people show, and in a culture full of moral cowardice, and a culture that is being governed by just this absolute dehumanized evil. So it's a very, very important film. The thing I really love about this film, and this is a movie that I'd watch probably at least twice a year, and as I said, I think it's so criminally underrated that I still regularly encounter people who say to me, I've never heard of Sophie Scholl, I've definitely never heard of this film. So I'd highly recommend this movie. But what I love about this film really is its use of symbolism, and it does this so well, and it really is a film that it's not trying to go for vacuous special effects and tricks and gimmicks. It's just not trying to do any of that sort of stuff. It's not trying to wow you with sort of visual sensationalism. It's trying to actually get you to think a little bit deeper. There's great subtlety here, but very, very profound imagery as well that's presented on screen. So starting with Robert Moore, who is the policeman, the interrogator, the federal agent of the state, basically, who is there to interrogate Sophie Scholl. It's a fascinating journey that they go on through this interrogation process. And he is very much a representative of a couple of different things. He is symbolic, first of all, of the German state. Very much at the start, he's very forthright about his commitment to Nazism and the advantage that it has given to him. He talks about the damned Treaty of Versailles, which obviously was a hugely negative influencing factor in what happened and paving the way for Nazism. And so it's an important little reference there to the Treaty of Versailles. But he starts by talking about how he has been personally advantaged by Nazism, and he talks about the positives of Nazism. He's part of the system. He represents those Germans who willingly participated in the evils of Nazism. But then by the end of the dialogue that they're having, by the end of the interrogations, he is now very much a representative of the German people who went along with Hitler, who bought into moral cowardice, who did not stand on the side of goodness, truth and beauty, who weren't necessarily directly involved in what the Nazis were doing, but just stood by and did nothing out of fear, out of self-interest, whatever reason, they gave in to moral cowardice. And you see this by the end of their interrogation. He has a child who is a similar age to Sophie, and he is trying to convince her that she should basically strike a deal with him to get herself off, say that it's all her brother's idea, that it was all Hans's idea, and that she was sort of like almost like an unwilling or a very naive participant. And courageously, she refuses. She stands her ground, and he's very convicted. He starts out very self-assured. He represents the state. The state is strong, total war, the dominance of the state, this brave new world that they're building. But by the end of it, he has been challenged and shaken to his very core by this 21-year-old woman who is in front of him during this interrogation and who challenges his conscience in ways that clearly it has not been challenged in a long time. And there are several really beautiful and profoundly important moments in that interrogation where he is forced effectively to quickly deflect or change topics, or you see it in his eyes. It's so well acted, and he can't bring himself to admit that she's right, but you can tell he knows that she is right. And there's another beautiful expression of this in the courtroom where the judge who represents the state is so adamant that these people are traitors and everyone in the room considers you to be a traitor, but it's quite clear at a couple of key moments that no, they know that what they're doing is wrong, but there's this moral cowardice where they've sort of got into this false dichotomy where it's like, well, what's the other alternative? And Robert Moore just can't bring himself to do the right thing, which is to stand with Sophie and to actually segregate himself from the evil of Nazism. Instead, he would rather go along with it. And there's this beautiful moment, and this is a really great moment of symbolism, because ultimately he is a Pontius Pilate type character. Pontius Pilate, who obviously pronounces sentence on Jesus and then immediately proceeds to wash his hands of the whole affair as if somehow that's enough. Well, that's exactly what Robert Moore does. As soon as he signed the documents basically pronouncing sentence or pronouncing her guilt, he then goes over to a little wash basin in the corner of his office and he washes his hands, and the scene ends there with him having washed his hands. It is pitch perfect symbolism. He is a Pontius Pilate figure, but that's not good enough, because he then goes to the jail, we see later on, just before they're executed, and he sees them. He has an encounter with Sophie. And according to the records we have, this actually happened. He came back. The movie is very accurate to the history of it. There's been a few little changes, but it's a very accurate telling of the history. He came back to his office, his staff said, and he was white and shaking by this encounter that he'd had. He knew what he'd done was wrong. So it's not enough to say, well, I've washed my hands of it and I'm just a servile agent of the state. It's not really me. He was complicit, and his moral cowardice was the thing that dragged him right into the heart of this, and he very much was part and parcel of. He has a culpability, a subjective culpability for his own moral actions, even though he wants to wash his hands of that. Then we have this next, a really beautiful moment of symbolism where Sophie is with her mother and her father. They are allowed a brief visit together before she's about to be led off down a hallway with the others, taken out across a courtyard and then executed on a guillotine. So she knows she's going to die at this moment. And there's this profoundly beautiful moment of symbolism. A big part of Hans and Sophie Scholl and other key members of the White Rose was the fact that their Christian faith is quite an important component, and it's not a superficial accounting of the Christian faith. It is a very deep accounting of the Christian faith for them that is very much grounded in this idea of confronting the reality of suffering in the human experience. It's not superficial. It's not this idea of God as some sort of big Santa Claus in the sky who hands out lollies and presents to everyone who follows him. It's a much deeper account, and so the movie really reflects this in a beautiful way. You have, I think, some of the best presentations of an authentic and deep Christian philosophy that I've seen in a film ever. Often, certainly within what you might call Christian films, you get what I think is just cheap propaganda, and it's to me it's like the Last Jedi type levels of propaganda. It's not artistic, it's not really deep, it doesn't say a lot about the human condition, it's just there to sort of try and preach a message. This film is not like that. It's very much an organic and holistic integration into the life of this character and to the real culture that they embraced. And so there's this beautiful moment where she's with her parents, and her father tells her that he is proud of her for what she has done, which is, to me, is just such a profoundly wondrous gift for a father to say that to his child who is about to be executed by the state for resisting and speaking up against the state. Her mother takes her hands, and there's this beautiful exchange between them, and towards the end of it she says, Sophie, remember to look to Jesus. And Sophie, this 21-year-old girl who's about to be taken down the hallway, out across the courtyard and executed on a guillotine, and she knows this. She takes her mother's hands and she says, yes, you too, mother, remember to look to Jesus. And it's such a profoundly deep accounting for who she was, for the deep philosophy around suffering and self-sacrifice that informed their actions and who they were in the culture that they embraced. But more importantly, there's really beautiful imagery here. There is imagery of the Trinity, this Christian idea of God, who is three divine persons in one, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Three in one, a community of divine persons. This is Christian theology and Christian philosophy of who God is. And that sort of symbolism is throughout this film. And this is one of the big moments where you see this, because it's fascinating the way they actually film the embrace. They have a final embrace together. The mother, the father, and the daughter. And you might imagine in your head that you would film an embrace like that, you'd just have them doing a big group hug. But they don't. It's really fascinating. The camera's almost sort of side on. There's a barrier between them, like a desk thing between them. Sophie reaches over, her father embraces her, and then the mother is embracing, she's got a hand on Sophie, but she's embracing the father. She's leaning on the father. And it's a fascinating little piece of visual imagery, because it's not what you call a typical family group hug thing that you would imagine, everyone just sort of huddled together. The mother is actually embracing the father, and what it symbolizes is the fact that family was so essential to there's this unified community of family, and family was so pivotal to the culture that they embraced to oppose Nazism with. And it's also this idea of the, as I said, the Christian representation of the Trinity, where you have different members of the Trinity which who embrace each other, so the Father and the Son in an embrace of love. And then that love between them is fruitful, and, in Christianity, that love is referred to as the Holy Spirit. And so this film depicts that. And you have it's a symbolism of the fact that the father and the wife have embraced many years, 21 years, 22 years previously, and obviously this total act of bodily self-giving love, human sexuality, and that love has been fruitful, and Sophie is the outworking of that love. It's quite a profound thing, and it's also symbolic of the Trinity in that way. It's quite fascinating in community. There's something really interesting here. This idea that when you, like in family or in any sort of authentic community, when you embrace one member of a community, you embrace the whole community. So when the mother is embracing the father, she's not just embracing the father, she's also embracing Sophie. And when Sophie is embracing her father, she's not just embracing her father. They're not individuals anymore, they're a unified whole. She's also embracing her mother and every other member of the family who wasn't present in that room as well. It's quite a profoundly beautiful and deep piece of symbolism. Then we come to the crescendo, and it's interesting where the crescendo of this film lies, because the crescendo of this film is not what you think it might be. You would imagine that the crescendo of this film might be the big execution scene, but it's actually not. The crescendo moment in this film comes in the jailhouse, where the jailers, who apparently, the film doesn't tell you this, but I've read several books about the Scholls and the White Rose and this incident, and apparently the jail staff was so profoundly impacted by the goodness and the truth and the beauty that just exuded from Hans and Sophie and Christoph Probst, that they allowed them a little moment that they wouldn't have normally been allowed to experience while they're in a jail awaiting a death sentence. And it's interesting because, first of all, what it shows you is even in a culture of death, a culture of darkness, if you go into that culture of darkness and death with a culture of life, of goodness, truth and beauty, you don't respond with violence, you don't respond with your own aggression, but you respond with an authentic self-sacrificial love for truth, for goodness, for beauty. It's lived out, it's expressed in who you are. It's very countercultural, and you can't help but have a shaping effect on the world around you. There's this analogy, and this was I won't go into the details, but this was quite an important analogy in the build-up to the formation of the White Rose, but this idea of them being like an anvil. If you imagine Nazism as like the hammer that's raining down blows upon Germany, upon the world, upon individuals, upon families. You can respond by reining back your own blows, or you can respond like the anvil does. And the anvil is just this solid chunk of steel which holds its ground. And by holding its ground and not retaliating in kind, because it holds firm in something that's good, true, and beautiful, that's objective, that is much bigger, that's transcendent, it holds its ground, and it's also able to shape the metal around it. We often think that only the hammer blows do the shaping, but you forget that in actual fact, just by holding your ground, you can also do that. And that's what they did. They held their ground in a culture of goodness, truth, and beauty, and they started to shape the metal of the lives of those people in that they encountered in the lead up to the execution, those jailers. And so they're allowed this moment that they never would have normally been allowed, where they are told that they can go and have a moment together, the three of them, Hans, Sophie, and Christoph Probst, and they can have a cigarette together. And this is a profoundly beautiful moment of symbolism, especially when you know the story. The film doesn't have the actual words that Christoph Probst said, but in the moments before they died and they were in that embrace, Christoph Probst said to the others, "Who knew that dying could be so easy? In a moment, we'll all meet together in eternity." Profoundly beautiful, deep commitment and love that underpins what they do. And this film symbolizes that in the most beautiful way. So they're allowed this cigarette together. And the three of them, this is the crescendo moment of the film. The musical cues, the swells, they all rise. This is the crescendo. It's not the end of the film. In fact, the executions, we see the lead up to Sophie going onto the guillotine, and then it just fades to black, and all you hear is noise. And there's no music at all. It's very barren. Because the point is, that's not the most important pinnacle moment of their story. The execution is not, it's not death. That is the victory, the crescendo, the climax of this all. It's love. And this is what we see when they come together in this embrace. And first of all, they're standing there, the three of them, very closely together, and they share a cigarette, one last cigarette together. And there's this smoke that rises up, and they just look around in silence, and they just take turns at gazing at each other with this genuine gaze of communal love for these other people. And that's all that matters in this moment. It doesn't matter about Nazism and evil and what's about to happen to them. It's this profound moment of love. It's such a beautiful moment of symbolism for a whole lot of reasons. First of all, again, it is very much the idea of the Trinity. Three people engaged in an ongoing community of self-giving love. They look upon the others with total love and abandonment. And that's exactly what this moment is, and so visually and powerfully represents. Not only that, but you add a cigarette to the mix, and now you've got something interesting. You've got cigarette smoke that's rising upwards towards heaven. This is really, really important visual imagery and symbolism, because it's symbolic of the Old Testament temple worship, any sort of Christian liturgy that involves incense. Incense is a symbol of prayer, and it, just like the incense, the smoke of incense rises upwards, so Christian prayer rises upwards. It's very important symbolism. And this, in this film, the cigarette becomes the sort of substitute for incense. It's symbolic of prayer, and also the fact that they are about to make a self-sacrifice, the ultimate self-sacrifice of their life, to stand for what is good, true, and beautiful. They are about to be executed. And they are willingly going to that. And the cigarette smoke becomes like the symbolism of the incense. And in fact, when Sophie is put on to the guillotine, she is kind of laid out. It actually looks and appears like an altar the way it's been shot. It's a guillotine, but it's sort of shot from a lower angle. And she doesn't, like, it's not that she climbs up and steps her own way up. They pick her up by her arms that are bound and legs, and they slide her onto this thing. And in much the same way that you might slide an offering onto an altar, there are goods, if you like, that are offered as offerings. And that's the sort of, it's the symbolism. And it's so important because that's the heart of the story. The heart of the story is the idea of sacrifice, of offering your life to what is good, true, and beautiful, even if that might cost you everything. And that's exactly what the symbolism is showing us, and so profoundly and beautiful. And as I said, it's the crescendo moment. They embrace, after finishing the cigarette, they embrace in this total moment of love and abandonment. And the crescendo of the music, everything swells, and it reaches its climax when they embrace together in this embrace of total love, this communion, this community of persons who stood against an ideology of evil. And it is so profound, the symbolism that is there. And then finally, we have Sophie as she is walking across a courtyard she has to go out from one building, she has to walk across a courtyard, and they then take her and lay her out on the guillotine, and you see her head put through the hole for the guillotine, and you see the blade starting to drop, and then it fades to black, the music cuts out, and then what we see is you hear the others slowly come in, and they're just the sounds of their executions. But before she gets to that point, she has to walk across a courtyard, and this is this final profound moment of symbolism. She looks up to the sky, and the sun is shining. And the sun, those were some of her last words, actually, before she left her cell. According to one of her cellmates, we know this. And the sun is shining, and it's the warmth of the sun. She looks up towards heaven. It's this profound sense of symbolism, again, that Christian philosophy, theology, which underpinned the culture of goodness, truth, and beauty that they lived. And it's symbolized in the warmth of the sun. Traditionally, in Christianity, sun is seen as a symbolism for Christ. And the warmth of the sun, the light of the sun, is this idea of, Christ comes into the world, brings light. Christ comes into the world, brings profound warmth. And you often hear it in old Christian prayers and old Christian hymns and chants. This idea of sun, S-U-N, is often substituted for S-O-N, or even for God. And so it's a profoundly beautiful moment of symbolism. And what it is she walks out across this thing, and there's this life-giving warmth that embraces her. It's not the cold, evil brutality and barbarism of Nazism and the Nazis who are about to do this horrible thing to her. It's not the cold indifference of the moral cowardice of the people who are happily walking her across to her execution. It's the warmth of the sun, of something bigger, transcendent, true, good and beautiful that she has lived, and which is now embracing her in her final moments, which I guess brings me to what I think is so important about this film as an object lesson for us today, is they did not just oppose Nazism by joining in with the tactics of Nazism. You know the whole trend today, punch a Nazi? Let's respond to fascism with some violence or fascism of our own. That will destroy us. That will destroy us. That will destroy any culture that does that. It will destroy that culture, and it will destroy it very, very quickly. But instead, what you have with Hans and Sophie Scholl and the other members of the White Rose is they do something profoundly different and beautiful. They live a counterculture. They actually live this out. They live their own culture within that little community of goodness, truth, and beauty. And all of their actions, their activism, speaking out against Nazism, leaflet dropping at university campuses, putting up posters around towns at night when no one will catch them, with speaking out against Nazism. All of that activism flows out of and is informed by this community of goodness, truth, and beauty that they live. They get together, they celebrate, they feast, they read good books, important pieces of literature, they celebrate good art and music, and everything. They live a truly counterculture of community, of love, of goodness, of depth, of philosophy, of asking the big questions about life and exploring them deeply and in profound ways, and then everything flows out of that. And this community is not just a group of young people, there's older members of the community, there are people who are Christians, not just Christians, you've got people who are agnostic and atheist who are part of this community as well, you've got people in this community who are Christians but are different religious Christian denominations. It is so profoundly beautiful. It's an example of this community, and it's grounded very much on an authentic understanding of conscience. And we see this at one point played out very briefly in a dialogue that she has with Robert Moore during her interrogation, where they talk about conscience. And it could be very easy to mistake what she's trying to suggest here as she's trying to propose some form of moral relativism where everyone just makes up their own truth. That's not what she's saying. Instead, what she's talking about, this idea of a well-formed conscience, a conscience which is formed in truth and goodness, and which embraces beauty. And that should never ever be usurped or dominated by the state. It should never be usurped by others. The right to freedom of conscience is so profoundly important, but we also have a responsibility to actually form our own conscience. It's not moral relativism, anything goes. It's the fact that freedom of conscience must be respected, and we have an obligation to shape our conscience according to what is good, true, and beautiful. So that we can have a well-formed conscience, and when the moment arises that we will act according to what is good, true, and beautiful. And that's exactly what they did. And the writings and thoughts on conscience are so very important to them. In fact, a guy by the name of Cardinal John Henry Newman, who is English, and his works and writings on conscience, he wrote a lot on conscience, are translated into German, and they end up in Germany and they are very pivotal in shaping their thought. In fact, Sophie sent the entire works of Cardinal Newman to her fiancé at the time, who was fighting in the German army on the front lines, for him to read. So they're very, very influential. And this whole idea of a properly formed conscience, a conscience which is steeped in what is good, true and beautiful. So you don't respond to Nazism by let's punch a Nazi. Yes, the World War II had to be fought, and the Allies had to actually bring military force to mount a military defence against this unjust aggression and to save lives and to stop the barbarism. But we're talking here about how we respond as individuals, and how war is always, as a just defence, is always your last resort. And what we're seeing now today with the whole punch a Nazi movement is people who are just living in a state of violence. And it's about pure brute force and power. I don't like what they stand for, so I'm going to violently assault them and exert my power to get my ideas across. That is not a culture of goodness, truth and beauty. It is not community. It is just barbarism. It's basically barbarians, white nationalists or Nazis fighting against extreme people on the other end of the spectrum who are also violent and dangerous and who would quite happily use power to get their own ends, but in different directions. You've got to avoid both extremes, and it's not about walking in the middle. The way you avoid both extremes is by embracing a culture of goodness, truth, and beauty. And when you live that out fully, you offer something truly countercultural. And what you do is you don't respond with violence to Nazism, you respond with goodness, truth, and beauty that's lived out. And the way that you treat others and your family, the way that you engage in your business dealings, the way that you speak, the things that you fill your heart and your mind with. What is your primary entertainment medium, and does it represent goodness, truth and beauty? Because the more you fill yourself with that stuff, the more it comes out somewhere. And so all of these things contribute to, I think, an authentic response to Nazism or neo-Nazism or whatever it might be, whatever the evil ideology might be. It's not about brute force and power. That's the barbarian response. I would suggest a true and good response, and one that holds a society together and stops it from collapsing into anarchy and chaos and bloodshed and everything else, is a culture of goodness, truth and beauty. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. A huge thank you to all the supporters of the channel, those who are financially supporting my channel. I'd really appreciate if you like the content I'm producing, you find some value in it, even just leaving a tip in the tip jar below on PayPal, just a one-off donation. Every little bit helps, especially with the current adpocalypse and what's going on. And I guess it goes without saying that you definitely should be watching Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, if you haven't seen the film. And please, don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.